She had learned, before she could read the count of stars over the scrub, a single injunction that sat like coal beneath her ribs. Never lower your head. Her mother had pressed those words into her palm with a voice like a thread of dry tobacco smoke, urgent and thin, and in the years that followed, Benedita carried them as one keeps a secret talisman. The warning was not sweetness, it was an economy of dignity, a measure against abasement that might otherwise be dispensed for coin or fear. In the narrow nights of the Senzala, beneath the rafters that kept the house's heat humming like a trapped insect, the phrase became a small song. When the overseer's boot came too close, or when Tomas's shadow leaned on the door, the women would tap 3 times against the wooden post and answer, without moving their eyes from their own hands, "Never lower your head." The Casa Grande stood on a slope that tasted of sea and iron. In 1836, the walls were whitewash, holding the sun's glare like a held breath. The front columns caught light and multiplied it into a dozen small judgments. Mirrors lined the inner room like tribunal windows. They reflected spindles of sunlight, ruffles of linen, the bright, untroubled face of Donna Constanza as she drew her skirts and ordered the household's day. Behind those mirrored self-possessions, stairs descended to the place where heat gathered and complaints took on the weight of possibility, the Senzala. The 2 halves of the estate breathed the same wind and kept different kinds of count. One counted servants, silver spoons, and the days until market. The other counted sorrows, small graces, and the exact time of each footstep that meant either bread or lash. On the day it began to tilt, the household's clock seemed to conspire with a sky that smudged the sun with distant humidity. Benedita moved through the courtyard with a pail balanced on her hip, the rope's fray thin against the callus of her fingers. She had been up before the others, setting coals so the mistress could lay herbs in a bath, scattering citrus rinds into the water to scent it, as if scent could stand between a body and the world. There was the usual choreography. The mistress's nurse, the folded towels ready like small white altars, Joachim, still a child then, skimming near a doorway as if the world's edges were a place to practice insolence. Then a sound, a clap like a hand smitten across skin, split the little chamber open. Benedita had seen such sounds before, seen them handed down like currency, and then demanded back in apology and obeisance. This one had been sharper than usual. It was not the sound of instruction. It was the sound of a law made suddenly and in public. Benedita saw Donna Constanza's hand rise, and heard the slap kiss the air and meet with immediate hush. The woman who had been spoken of as the Sina, refined, measured, clothed in whites that never showed the earth's dirt, stood composed as if she had only read a line, and then placed it with iron certainty. The man who had been struck, an older lass in a servant's garment, put forward for fawning, stumbled back, eyes wide with the humiliation that travels like a contagion. Tomas's jaw tightened. Senor Juan Batista's mouth did not move. Benedita felt the air thicken with the household's disapproval and agreement all at once. After the slap came the tronco. After the tronco, the heads bowed as if the world itself required sacrificial posture. Benedita watched the event like someone watching a fire in the distance. The light explained less than it revealed. The lashings were there, and yet were not the central score. What inscribed itself onto Benedita's ribs was the look on Donna Constanza's face, less triumphant than relieved, as if asserting that gesture into the room had confirmed some ledger had been balanced. The public nature of it was the wound, to be corrected in the sight of others, to have shame measured out in the open where neighbors might count it and remember. Shame had a way of sticking to the bones of a person. It made certain futures impossible. When the night drew and the Casa Grande settled into its velvet of lantern flame, Benedita trailed to the low window and sat with her back to a wall that had seen other uprisings in whispered, careful forms. Her hands were steady, though the world inside her had moved. She remembered, as the others were folding their blankets and breathing under the pretense of sleep, what her mother had said through the sharp coughs and the little rustles of fear. Never lower your head, not as a provocation, but as a ledger of self-worth. Not as a dogma, but as a memory of what one could keep for oneself when everything else had been given away. To refuse to bow was not merely an act of pride. Those words carried the slow arithmetic of survival. If you bend to that, you invite them to bend you again in another place. If you make your neck an entry, they will keep untying knots there and throw in more. Benedita's refusal was not youthful heat. It was the tempered patience of a person who has watched the world tally its currencies and decided to learn another kind of accounting. She weighed possibilities as a farmer weighs days of rain, marginal, grimed with risk and yet essential. The plan did not arise as sudden revenge. It began as mapping. Benedita spent the next days watching where the mistress walked and when she liked to drink her tea, noting the cadence of Tomas's steps. She learned the hour when Señor Juan Batista would be in his study, hunched over ledgers and never looking for what a servant might be planning. She watched Joachim more out of curiosity than concern, and found him sometimes at the gate with a rope of shells, sometimes with a book in his hand that he pretended to read, while instead picking at the seams of the world like someone testing a stitch. Azira was the first to meet Benedita's glance with understanding. Azira's hands were clever with flame. She kept embers that never seemed to die, and could curl a coal with the tenderness of a mother tending a child. Rosa had the care of distractions, and would laugh a certain loud laugh when the mistress's guard was thinnest, redirecting attention like a practiced midwife. Sira, small-boned and quick-fingered, moved among pockets and folds, knowing that the house made its fortunes in hidden caches. Together, they formed something like a household inside a household, a council that spoke in whispers and in the clipped tap of 3 on wood. The women rehearsed without words at first. They moved through the daytime rhythm as if practicing a play where the props were ordinary and the stakes were anything but. Benedita would carry a filled pail for the mistress's wash and pretend to spill as a test. Azira would step close to damp the hem of Donna Constanza's dressing gown with a thread of steam that smelled faintly of citrus. They learned the routes of the servants, the times the dogs slept, the cadence of the gatekeeper's rounds. At night, when the house was a low breathing thing, they would sing the wordless song, 2 notes like a sigh and then the hum of 3, and in that song the memory of the mother's phrase threaded itself into the air. Their rehearsals had the necessity of small, nearly invisible work, learning to keep the sound of a running foot from carrying to where Tomas paced, training a hand to toss a rag that would draw attention in the chamber long enough for a body to move the opposite way. They practiced silence as one practices prayer, often devotedly, and with the terrifying knowledge that failure would not simply be embarrassment, but a rip through many lives. They drew maps with the soot of the kitchen hearth on the underside of a wooden board and marked the days where the mistress took a bath after the market, when the housemaid sent word to the mistress that the grease on the hearth needed tending. They learned the father's habits. He liked to sign a ledger in the afternoon and then take a walk by the sea to let the salt do what words could not. Outside the walls, the world had other hands. News travelled in different forms, knives, songs, and short messages held in the hollow of a reed. Benedita walked once to the edge of the property as if she had errands, and then crossed the path of a neighbour who sold fish. There, near where the road spat out dust and the sea glittered indifferent, she met a woman whose hair was shaved at the temple and whose chest bore a small white scar from an old fever. This woman's name was Maria de Lanza, a word for a spear, and she had once been free. She had a house not far from where the plantation road met the lane to the market, and in that house men and women rested who could not be taken back. Maria spoke of a quilombo beyond a stand of mangrove, no more than rumour, she said, and every rumour in that year had the weight of a lifeline. It was the beginning of a map that was not drawn on wood but on the bones of those who remembered. Routes where one might vanish into the arms of others, houses where a hidden bed might be waiting. In those small exchanges, Benedita understood the larger arithmetic. If the act were performed, the immediate need would be to unmake the tracks of what had been done. It was one thing to decide to refuse. It was another to plan the following steps, to negotiate with reality's coldness. Who would take them if the house raised its voice? Tomas's voice, like a bell, calling for names and for the bodies of those who had moved. Who would keep their silence under the pressure of a crown's purse? Benedita knew that the answer must be not merely one house but several hands working in concert. They fashioned signals. 3 knocks at the east wall meant retreat. A spoon tied to the gatepost in a certain notch meant that a safe passage had been arranged with neighbours. A cloth left on the wind meant the house had changed its watching. Sira learned to hide a small scrap of cloth inside the lining of a basket and to pass it along market days as if it were a portion of interest. Benedita learned to look at the sea not as a thing to long for, but as a ledger of exits, boats that left and came back, the names of captains who might take a hand too long in the dark. Every daily motion took on two counts, the motion itself and the shadow of the motion as it might be used in service of escape. They rehearsed for weeks under the thin eye of daily chores. Benedita found herself practicing the exact motion of carrying a bucket so that it would look the same whether it was mere water or a scald. She taught her wrist to hold steady and her eyes to keep a softness that would not betray the rope she had coiled under her skirt. When Joaquim played near the corridor, she did not look at him in the way a conspirator might. She watched him as if she wished for another life for him than the one that would be carved by what his mother required. There was a compassion in this. One does not plan harm out of hatred, so much as out of a desire to reclaim something that was taken, an act that aims to correct the ledger of power, even as it knows the ledger is never clean. Tomas moved through the house like a measuring stick, his brutality not as a first resort, but as a policy. He had been trained to read the angles of a house. He watched skirts for concealments and tested the backs of servants for the habit of long sleep. He did not often strike for the sake of sport. He struck to mark discipline and to bind others to that discipline. This made him dangerous because he was methodical. Benedita recognized in him a certain predictable cruelty, and there is a kind of power in predictability. It allows you to count the ways a person will respond. On one of the early evenings, Benedita stood with Azira in a raised copse just beyond the kitchen, watching the mistress's bath being prepared through a lattice. The steam rose like a plume from a pot of simmering herbs and citrus, smelling faintly of bay and of something sharp that cleared the lungs. Donna Constanza moved slowly in this private ritual. It was her own small performance of control. She spoke softly to her maid and to the nurse about the coming festival and about the coat she would wear for the governor's inspection. Benedita watched the way the mistress's fingers smoothed a towel as if it were an altar, the way she peered into the basin to assure itself that the water reflected well. There were times when Benedita permitted herself to imagine that humiliation could be rewritten without bloodshed, an apology obtained, a public gesture that resumed some balance. But these were fantasies that dissolved with the dawn. The world they lived in did not operate on regret. It responded to force and to consequence. It would not make amends because one woman got her pride returned. For the mistress to cede anything would be to admit a loss in public, and neither she nor Señor Juan Batista were men whose accounting allowed for such an entry. In the span of those slow weeks, little things shifted in the household's geometry. The mistress began to wear her dresses a touch tighter in the chest, as if closure could hold off attention the way a corset holds an exposed lung. She placed a small embroidered handkerchief on the pillow where her son slept, as though to mark what belonged and to shield it. Joaquim, for reasons that even his family could not name, began to walk a little apart from the other boys. He kept a distance that was not quite insolence and not quite reserve. Sometimes he would go down to the dock and watch the men catch fish, as if assessing the ways bodies surrendered to their tasks. He laughed less and learned the names of sails, the things that will take you out and might never return. There were conversations, too, the slow kind that wrap around a cup of coffee and return to the thing you were trying to avoid. In the dark of a back room, Señor Juan Batista sat with Tomas, smoothing the cloth on his lap, as a man smooths the surface of a pond to assure himself of no ripple. "A scandal," the Señor said quietly, "is a wound in reputation that festers. We cannot have this breathing against us." Tomas agreed and suggested measures, searches at dawn, rewards for information, the tightening of keys. The father's voice carried not only a fear of shame, but a calculation. A household's power is public as much as it is private. To be seen as weak is to invite others to take advantage. When word reached them that an emissary had seen a woman cross the lane into Maria de Lanza's fold, the household tightened like a fist. Notices were posted, bounties whispered in the market, and the mistress lay awake tracing the lines on her hand as if they might tell the path to the thief. The community around them shifted too. Neighbors who had once smiled at the Sinar's carriage now lowered their heads when she passed, for the multiplication of attention was a dangerous thing. In the Senzala, the women grew quieter and more distant, learning to hold a secret, as one keeps a small, hot coin. There are acts that stare the world full in the face, and others that are built on the long arithmetic of small, patient movements. Benedita's method was the latter. She measured the day in small reckonings, the hour of a bath, the time the overseer took his smoke behind the arbor, the second the nurse's hand lingered over the mistress's silver box. She timed her own breathing with the household's rhythm, learning the soft places where presence was not noticed and where movement could be mistaken for continuous servitude. She and her companions practiced the mimicry of the obedient to such a degree that those who watched would have sworn their docility was real. Still, fear does not vanish. It calibrates a person's soul to recognize consequences, like the way a dancer recognizes the next step. Benedita and her friends kept count of the names they could not provoke into silence, of the children who might be fathered by the men of the house, of the mothers whose loss could not be replaced by any flight. They spoke often of what they would do with the days that might come afterward. It was not the triumph that consumed them, but the logistics of survival. Who to send to the Quilombo to wait, which neighbor's chimney might hide a woman undetected, the price of a small boat or a forged pass. They set aside the emotional calculus of revenge and faced the arithmetic of escape. On a morning when the air promised the ache of a storm and the sky kept its low, heavy gaze, Benedita sat with the bucket at her feet and let her lips press against the coolness of the wooden handle. The house was alert. The mistress had announced a small feast for a visiting magistrate's wife and had gone to her room to prepare. It meant the rituals would be longer and the bath more elaborate. The hour that held the mistress's time on the day of visiting was the hour that favored crowds and small moments of inattention. Benedita counted the hours in her head like beads and rehearsed the single motion they had practiced 100 times without naming it. There are ways in which a body prepares itself for something that will mark it forever. Benedita walked the path to the bath and felt the muscle memory of 1,000 small chores steady her hand. Her heart made a politic rhythm. Careful, deliberate, not easy. She thought of her mother as if she were a presence in the room, the old voice reminding her not to lower her head, even while the motion she planned demanded an odd posture of concealment. She remembered the small flowerings of her mother's hands when she braided a child's hair, the way she would hum an old song that had no words but held the cadence of resistance. That song rose now in Benedita's mind, a thin wire connecting movement to ancestry. Just before the appointed hour, she met with Azira and Rosa and Sira in a shed that smelled of lime and ash. Each of them was a study in restraint. Azira's hands were steady and soot-smudged. Rosa had the distraction of a laugh, ready as if a trick could stop a bell. Sira had a small scrap of paint that could make any brass look like a poor attempt at adornment. They checked the ties and the small cloths that would serve as signals. There was no grand speech. They did not need one. The consolidation of quiet would be their oath. Outside, the household shifted toward its appointed ritual. Dogs were coaxed away, servants were sent to light extra lamps in distant corners. Joachim, under some pretense, walked the garden where he bent over a page and tried to copy a sketch he had made of a mast. In the study, Senor João Batista lingered over accounts and thought of reputations. The mistress, dressed in the crisp finery she had reserved for the day, moved with the air of someone who believed she could manage each line of her life. She could not imagine in any useful way what it meant to be undone by the most ordinary element, water, recast as a tool of a different sort of reckoning. They chose a moment when the house's attention was elsewhere, the visiting magistrate's wife distracted by the display on the dining table, Thomas called away to inspect a gate, a servant whispering gossip by the horse stables. Benedita carried the bucket and felt its heat like an accusation against her palm. For a span of heartbeats, she allowed herself a strange imagining. The mistress's face, composed, refined, splitting into a new recognition. The world, for once, seeing the ledger reversed. Then she pushed the thought away because hope and revenge are cousins who do not always keep the same table. There is an hour at which all patterns show their seam. It is a soft and dangerous thing, the neatness that people rely upon frays at some small, predictable place. Benedita had learned to find that seam and to trust that each household, however tightly stitched, let a thread go somewhere. She breathed in, feeling the salt the sea had left in the air, and with the practiced steadiness of one who has long served, she crossed the margin between the kitchen and the mistress's private room. If a story requires a single line to be told well, it is sometimes the moment a person steps through a door and knows in their bones that the house will never be the same. Benedita pushed the wooden pin aside and looked at the bath, steam rising like a promise, and the white towel spread like a small altar of invited dignity. Her hands remembered her mother's words, and yet carried something else too, the knowledge that dignity sometimes required one to make a choice that would cost. She did not feel triumphant. She felt instead the clear, cold arithmetic of an action that could not be reversed. Outside, a gull called, and the house settled into the shape of attention. Inside, the mistress hummed a crooked hymn of porcelain and lace, unaware that the seam had been found. Benedita's fingers closed on the handle of the bucket. The weight was not heavy. It was accurate. If this tale pulls at you, stay until the end to learn what became of the mistress's son. A silence held then, thin like a drawn veil. Benedita paused at the threshold a single second, and in that breath all the models she had built in secret converged. She saw in her mind the faces of those who had taught her, the whisper-taught maps of escape, the shapings of a life that might be made outside the house's ledger. She thought of the children in the Senzala, who would not know their mothers if those mothers were taken away. She thought of Joachim with his rope of shells, and felt a small unnameable pity. The motion that was coming would not set free anyone's future with a clear hand. It would only open a seam and set the household to bleeding its own order. Benedita had spent months studying how to move so that movement looked like a servant's ordinary chore. She had tuned her hand to be indistinguishable from a duty's shape. Now in the final gathering of resolve, she had to still herself to do nothing but what she had rehearsed. Her heart beat an ordered thing, not a wild one. Within the house, the servants' rhythms carried a double meaning. The dog's snore that hid the squeak of a foot, the waning light that masked a shadow. Benedita laid the bucket down, felt the heat through the wood, as if the very floor knew why she had come. Her retina filled with small carved things, the mistress's ring, the glass of tea set aside too suddenly, the neat curl of a towel waiting like an accusation. There was a moment in which Benedita's head bowed, not to an order but in the way a person bows to the gravity of what they are about to do. She did not lower it in shame. She did it because to lift it again was the transaction she had decided to make, a life for a life's chance, a secrecy for a memory, The air turned thick, and the house seemed to hold its breath. In the Senzala, someone hummed the wordless song as a small animal might hum when danger is near, a low, vibrating chord that tells the body to be ready without naming why. The 3 taps on the post, once, twice, thrice, followed, a response and a readiness. Outside, in the lane, someone shifted, the sound of a foot scraping against earth. There were hands on keys and a whisper about a neighbor's gate to be opened should they be pursued. Benedita's hand rose to the handle again. The seam had been found. The rest waited, as a book waits to be opened. She could still turn away. She could still decide that dignity, her mother's phrase, was to be kept intact by silencing action. There was room yet for a life of small resistances that never directly broke a law, but always bent it by degree. The world offered, as it always does, half-choices and partial freedoms. She stepped forward. The door side closed behind her. The bath steamed as if the room exhaled at last. The mistress turned her head, the ribbon at her throat nervous as if it too felt the small loosenings of a system. Benedita's breath met the mist in the doorframe, and in that fog her eyes caught Donna Constanza's face, an array of gossamer control that had never once acknowledged the collared breath and countenance beneath. Benedita felt no hatred that might be mistaken for frenzy. She felt the steady, cold mathematics of consequence. Outside, someone started a song the way one starts a line of defense. 3 notes echoed under the eaves and were swallowed by the house. In the Senzala, the women held themselves in the shape of compassion and of steel. They had rehearsed the exit as they had rehearsed the entry, 3 steps forward, 1 step back. The dogs to be unsettled in the precise order that would scatter any suspicion, the cart at the lane to give one last countermotion that would make the house believe flight had been elsewhere. Within the room, the water trembled like something that had been holding a secret. Benedita's hands were sure. Her mother's voice hummed in the marrow of her grasp, soft and ancient. She thought again of Joachim, and of the possibility, remote, stubborn, that his life might bend away from the path his mother's pride insisted upon. She thought of the Quilombo's unseen face, of the way Maria de Lanza had smiled with the look of someone who had been through fire and still kept a certain tenderness for others. She lifted the bucket. At the threshold of action, 1,000 small probabilities aligned: the dog that sometimes barked not, the servant that sometimes lingered at the wrong step, the gatekeeper that sometimes saw and sometimes chose to look away. In the house above, Senor João Batista still kept his ledger, as if numbers could hold the household whole. In the dock beyond, a ship's name was being blotted from the list of possibilities. Somewhere a child hummed a tune that would, in years to come, be remembered as the song of a night when something irrevocable was done. Benedita pulled the pail toward her, the water's steam a soft veil that hid the world's reactions from her face. Her foot found the room's worn plank in the same way a compass finds north. Her hand tipped, a small, practiced action designed to mimic the spilling of a daily chore. The mistress's face registered surprise, like a pet disturbed from a long indoor nap. Time conspired to slow, to stretch the seconds into a long rope of possibility. Then, in the moment when the water's arc began, when the world could have still pivoted to 1,000 other scenes, an apology, a pause, a sharp intake of breath, something gave outside the door. A sound small, and then sharp as a snapped twig. Feet that were not meant to be there took a wrong measure. A shout that was not meant to be shouted breathed one syllable into the air. The motion halted in Benedita's hand. Her palm tightened on the handle. The world, like a body that has held its breath long, found the capacity to let in the next immediate sound: the dog's tongue, the mistress's quick intake, the distant clank of a pan. The seam had been found. Whether it would widen or close now depended on the measure of danger and of faith, both. She stood with the pail poised between her and the order that had kept so many small, quiet violences in place. There are choices whose consequences bifurcate into lives you cannot see. Benedita's jaw set, as if against a tide. The house was still, as if anticipating a verdict. Her friend's signals waited like birds ready to give flight. Outside, the world held its own counsel, and in the next breathing it would decide whether to repel or to accept the charge. The song from the Senzala swelled and then fell away, leaving a single note that trembled like a held spine. She could still step back. She could still bow and let the ledger remain. She did not move. The mistress's mouth opened as if to form the name of the thing that would make this moment ordinary. Benedita's hand tightened on the handle, and in that touch, the house's history seemed to pivot. The seam had been found, and the next motion would tell whether the household would continue as it had, or whether the mistress's cruelty would find its mirror. The truth of what came next waited only for the continuation of a single movement. Downward, decisive, unspooling the tether that had bound the women for years. The water left Benedita's hands like a sentence that could not be unsaid. It broke from the pail in a hot silver arc and met the mistress's shoulders before any other sound could make a claim on the room. The steam rose, thick with citrus and bay, and whatever small decorum painted Donna Constanza's face melted into a different geography: surprise, then pain, then a new shape of fear that did not belong to her alone. She flinched, her fingers clutching the towel as if it might stitch her skin back into order. A cry left her that was half a woman's alarm and half the brittle note of a household's dignity cracking. For a long breath, the world in that chamber held only sound and movement in the strictest detail. The slap of a towel, the clatter of a glass knocked to the floor, Tomas's boots like a hammer striking wood. Then the house took back its voice. Commands, a shout, the slam of a door, 1,000 small decisions made to keep what was broken from being spoken of outside. The servants who had been practicing the economy of ordinary gestures now had need of the other economy they had kept, the economy of sudden flight, of covering tracks, of turning a routine into a camouflage. Talzira did what she had always been good at. She transformed herself into a figure too present to be unseen. She laughed, a sound like the snapping of a twig, and shoved a footstool into the path of a maid who hurried in to see what had happened. Rosa let loose a deliberate cry toward the garden, a rehearsed confusion that pulled one of the household boys out into the sun. Zira had already slipped to the back corridor and opened the small shutter that led to the lean-to, where the ladders were kept. It all moved with the precision of hands that had practiced survival in the shadows. Benedita had not miscalculated the first part. The water had hit. What she had accounted for with labor and care was the next part, how the house would close and whether the seam would remain open long enough for the women to pass through it. She saw, in a fragmentary way, the nurse pressing a linen to the mistress's arm, the mistress's face work like someone learning new grief. The sound of Tomas's voice came like a bell tolling for accusation, and Señor Juan Batista's presence filled the doorway with a kind of quiet that was not peace. He looked as if sums were being subtracted from him, and the total did not add up. They moved. The exit had been worked into their bodies long before the event. 3 steps forward, 1 back. A dog given a bone to send its nose away. A cart creaking at the lane. Benedita kept hold of a thought like a bead. Do not look back, for the look back can turn a flight into a story that can be tracked. She turned her face only to the shadow that would take her, to the neighbor's gate that would open at the designated notch. Outside, the lane smelled of churned dust and the salt that clings to people who live near the sea. Maria de Lanza stood where she had arranged, hands tucked into the pockets of a coarse coat, the scar at her temple showing like an old seal. When Benedita appeared, breathless and with the salt of the bath still clinging to the hem of her skirt, Maria did not ask questions. She moved like a woman who had reconciled herself to the habit of taking those who were sent to her. A neighbor's boy had already let the gate swing. Another hand pushed a small bundle toward Benedita. Old clothes, a coarse shift to hide smooth skin from a lady's inspection, a simple scarf to wrap her hair. The cart that waited at the bend made no comment. They did not go straight to the Quilombo. That was a rumor for the long game. For the first hours, for the night that might decide everything, they went from house to house, a free woman who kept a warren of beds and hearths for those who had to vanish for a moon, a fisher whose wife would hold a kettle at dawn and pretend not to notice a damp skirt, a cobbler whose low back room had once hidden a runaway youth. Each offered a bed. Each held the door when the household's criers passed. Benedita moved with a privacy she had not known she bore so well. The lowering of eyes, the rote answers, the way feet can make no noise when the body learns not to be found. Inside the Casa Grande, the first order of men was calculation. Señor Juan Batista called for measures that were legal and those that were less so. He sent for the magistrate's man who handled such embarrassments, a functionary who both recorded and smoothed scandal, who offered the promise of an investigation that would find someone to take away the heat. Notices were posted, but the posting was formal enough to be a theater rather than an act, a ribboned threat, a public show that authorities were on the case. Rewards for information were whispered in the markets and made larger as the morning wore on. Tomas paced and spat, his face the color of a man whose instrument had been defied. He had to make an example. It was his trade, his shield. The house needed a visible enemy to reassert its shape. Donna Constanza lay in her bed that night and traced the pattern of pain as if it were a map she could walk to some end. There were places on her skin that flared like small maps of shame. The nurse wrapped cloths and brought salves, but the burn had the privacy of surprise. It refused to be dressed neatly into the language of medicine or gossip. The household's politesse was wounded in front of itself, and that was worse than any bodily inconvenience. To be seen as vulnerable in a society that equated power with the infallibility of outward form. Rumor, being a small animal, did what animals do. It nested in whatever silence it found. The village near the harbor had stories by afternoon, a woman with a bucket, a cry, a mother's song humming in the distance. Some stories were sober, some were vicious in their invention. Accounts of more clandestine cruelties, of the mistress's underhanded manipulations, of servants beaten for wanting to hide the truth. But such embellishments mattered less than the persistence of a central fact. The house had been pierced from inside. Not all the blame fell upon Benedita. The official hunt called for many names. Men were taken in for questioning, some of them poor in their attempts to explain. some of them used as examples by Tomas. A child confessed under the pressure of being kept awake and told half-truths that were stitched into the report. The household fumbled through its attempt to gather shame and bind it. In the attempt, it only multiplied wounds. Señor Juan Batista found that hiding hurt more than facing the wound, yet he could not quite bring a public gesture of contrition, because to do so would be to render transparent the ledger he cherished. As the days folded, the mistress's visible injury became another currency. Guests were fewer. The carriage that had once announced her arrival at the church sat idle more often. There were, too, the looks from neighbors who once tipped their hats with a deference now mixed with a curiosity that felt like a tally being kept against the household. Social capital had a way of leaving footprints across the kind of people who once stood near the Sinar to be seen and not noticed. The household's private shame threaded into the public marketplace. The Sinar moved through rooms with the effort of someone relearning her own manner, as if a practice could restore the sense of having never been wounded. For Joachim, the effects were quieter and slower. He was a boy when the event occurred, and there was a brittle watchfulness in the way his mother held him thereafter. She fussed in a manner that was not affectionate, but rather managerial, like a cook overseeing the perfect rise of a cake she would not eat. Joachim absorbed the increased attention as if it were something that alien had landed on his skin and could not be removed. There were whispers that he had seen Benedita's face before she left, that his innocent curiosity had been noticed. The truth, like all truths in a house that measures everything for its bearing on reputation, became malleable when it was necessary. In some versions told later, Joachim left by his own decision and sought the sea to escape the tender, burning eyes at home. In others he was sent, a forced exile to prevent the family's tale from being associated with its son. The fact of the matter bent itself the way a reed does in wind. Whichever way it bent, it never returned the same. He came to the port in a man's clothes too soon, boarded a vessel, and was given work that asked him to keep his hands busy so his mind would not dwell. The sea is a place for beginnings and erasures. It is a ledger that accepts and returns not what you expect. Rumors said he drank as a remedy for the weight that settled in his chest. Others said he learned to curse the name of his mother under his breath, the only place where he could talk without the house listening. Months later, men in a tavern near the docks would whisper a story that had many endings. Some said he died at sea in a storm that bared its teeth without warning. Some said he fell from a mast and was lost to a grave marked only by the toss of waves. Some spoke of his return, broken like a tool bent beyond repair, muttering of a night when the world had turned its face away. A few more generous versions claimed he lived long in exile to the north, working with hands that had not known pleasure, but had discovered an odd, quiet competence. The fact that the versions multiplied mattered less than the way the story worked as a mirror. The house's cruelty, in one telling or another, kept returning to haunt its own interior. Benedita heard the soft, muttering forms of these rumors. She learned them as one learns weather. Each telling was a current that could change one's course. She learned to accept that the narrative of her act would be distorted, storied, made into a thing that both comforted and unsettled. In the houses where she hid for the months after, elders would tell the tale to younger ones like a cautionary hymn. They tied the mother's phrase into it, sometimes as praise and sometimes as warning. "Never bow your head," they would say, and then, after a beat, "But know what the cost will ask." The song from the Senzala, 2 notes softened to a hum and then the long drone of memory, found its way into the retelling. The network that had taken Benedita in was not a single organism. It was a mesh of houses and hands that could not always be expected to hold forever. Sometimes a man with a greedy ear walked past and later made a choice that harmed those who had sheltered fugitives. Sometimes a child delivered the wrong message, and a searchlight of suspicion would fall on a free woman who had once saved a life. The Quilombo, distant and rumor-bearing, remained a place of final refuge for some. For Benedita, the solace of the Quilombo was the idea that others had preserved something against the world's appetite, a place where names were not ledgers, and where the blunt arithmetic of the house could be recalculated as community. She did not become a legend overnight. She learned a kind of small anonymity that weighed on her like a garment sewn of remaining stitches. She took on small work, mending nets, tending a garden in the house of a widow, who let her sleep under the eaves. She kept the phrase her mother had given her as a prayer and a ledger, whispering it on nights when her hands trembled. She did not, in those early years, take pride in the act. Its moral skein was too complex for neat overtures. It had freed nothing at a scale that could be named. It had not opened a door to a life where the heavy would be lightened. Instead, it had set into motion consequences that chewed at people in ways she had not intended. People's hearts are not furnaces of simple justice. The act that threatens a household's order scatters and sinks into places no one can fully measure. The mistress's suffering continued, not as a shaming spectacle, but as a private fatigue, a visible margin to her once perfect posture. Señor João Batista, who had lived by account and measure, found that there were ledgers that cannot be balanced with coin. He made investments in reputation, placing his money into hospitality and gifts, trying to buy silence and the acquiescence of the local gentry. He invited magistrates and gave to church altars, and in public his house resumed a kind of normalcy. But normal had a new line running through it, and everyone who lived there or near sensed the thinness of what had been restored. In time, the story reached a shape that spoke not only of what happened, but of what meaning people wished to draw from it. At markets, women mending clothes for passers-by would sing a brief strain, a song that held the moral like a bead. The mistress's arrogance had been turned back on the house. Children were told a version. There was once a Sina who struck, and the house learned it could be struck back. The phrase, "the mistress's cruelty turned against her own son," began to crystallize in the telling as proverbs do, blunted at the edges, but with a core that hummed with warning. It was not a slogan. It was a refrain that people used to make sense of power and cost. In some mouths it carried judgment, in others it carried sorrow. Those who had been present in the days of the event remembered other particulars, small and stubborn. Tomás grew harder, more watchful. He would wake in the nights and walk the courtyard, as if the house might unveil more seams. The nurse who had tended Donna Constanza would talk less about her employer, and more about a wound that was both bodily and social. Joachim's name, when spoken, was often accompanied by a small involuntary anger or pity. Both the confusion of a youth asked to carry a weight not his making, and the human instinct to find an agent to pin one's discomfort upon. Benedita, who had wanted to keep her head upright in the arithmetic of self-respect, learned that dignity can take shape in solitude and in shared stories both. She married, though it was not a marriage announced in any house of note. In a small shaded yard beyond the lane, she made a bed of a woven reed and slept sometimes with the quiet of someone who had survived a season of stones. Children came or did not, and the house of her hiding became a small archive of days that had not been ruined by public scandal. Sometimes, in the deep of nights when the moon sloughed her light across the roofs, Benedita would lay awake and repeat the wordless song from the Senzala into the darkness, not as triumph but as testament. The legend that arose around the night of the bath was not uniform. It was braided. In some tellings, Benedita was a shadow saint, a woman whose only crime had been to demand the dignity of her skin. In other tellings, she was a cautionary whisper. Do not presume that vengeance brings peace. People on ships at the docks would trade the story as they traded spices and stories of storms. In a tavern near the harbour, the tale served to pass the slow hours, an anecdote that fit the weather. And when children, years later, asked elders why certain people lived alone, and why certain houses spoke in small, hushed ways, the elders would repeat the refrain and let the moral remain ambiguous so that the young might hold both lessons, that cruelty can make its own ruin and that resistance exacts a price. The final shape of Joachim's fate stayed unfinished, as fates often do in rumour. In the most frequent telling, he was taken by the sea, either as a consequence of a fall or in a storm that made no distinction between guilt and grief. Some said his body was never found and that the house, relieved of the visible problem, breathed a small private sorrow. Others insisted he returned and became a shadow walking the docks, drunk and mute, a boy who had learned the contours of shame too early. There are versions where he rebuilt some semblance of life in distant ports and wrote letters home that were never read. All of them were ways for a community to make sense of the fact that the household's violence had not only hurt the immediate victim, but echoed into the lives of the family, the servants, and the wider world. Time, Being a teacher that neither forgives nor forgets, let the tale settle into a particular cadence. Benedita grew older in places that knew her only by a neighbor's name. She would, sometimes, visit the edge of the place where the great house still stood, watching from a lane while the columns reflected the sun. She felt no triumph in the sight. The memory of that bath loomed over the years the way a tide marks the beach. It had been an act of refusal, precise and patient, and it had remade certain lines of life. It had not ushered in utopia. It had not given back what was lost. It had, however, told a story to which the women under the rafters could attach a sense of agency, an example that one could plan and act if one must. The community remembered the night not for the spectacle, but for the lesson it made them uneasy to repeat. Resistance, when it comes, ripples. The women at the laundress's stall would nod at each other when the subject turned to the night, as if by nodding they were paying a subtle debt of recognition to the courage and to the costs. Sometimes at dusk, a small group would meet and hum the wordless song that still threaded their lives. It was not the same as rejoicing. The humming held memory and caution in equal parts. "Never lower your head," they would whisper, and then they would add, softer, "and carry what you must bear with the knowledge of what it asks." In the telling of such things, the moral does not offer simple absolution. The mistress's injury did not cleanse the world, it complicated it. The household was never again as untroubled as it had been, and Joachim's life, whatever version one might prefer to hold, became one of those human costs that sits uncomfortably in the corners of a tale. Benedita lived with those consequences, as with a stone in her pocket, a heavy thing that kept her aware of where her body had been and where it had yet to go. Decades later, when the little lane had become lined with different faces and the Casa Grande's paint had faded and been freshened by other hands, the story persisted. Children would be told the refrain in place of lullabies, and older women would use it as a means of instruction and warning. The phrase itself, the mistress's cruelty turned against her own son, matted into speech like a proverb. It was repeated in sentences that judged, in others that mourned, in a few that celebrated. In all of them the complexity remained, for the saying was not neat. The narrator who tells such tales cannot pretend the ledger is ever fully balanced. There are acts that aim at dignity, yet leave ruin in their wake. And there are those who suffer not for the sin they committed, but for the position they occupy in a household's architecture. Benedita's hands, the ones that had learned to keep the pail steady and to move like an unremarkable cog in a larger machine, carried the memory forward. She never sought accolades. She taught a child to braid hair, and hummed a hush into ears that would one day take the fields and the sea, and perhaps keep their own heads lifted in some other way. When the tale is told now, years from the steam and the immediate panic, people often fold its elements into the broader conversation about how societies keep power and what happens when those of little voice choose to be heard. The story sits at the intersection of dignity and consequence. It is not a parable that allows the reader to walk away with clear solace. It refuses that comfort. Instead, it gives back a complicated mirror. Acts of resistance can be both necessary and wound-making. Cruelty begets disruption that spares no household line. Memory is both a balm and a ledger. There is an old woman at the market who still hums a two-note strain when she sorts burlap sacks. When asked about the song, she names no grand heroes. She speaks of small economies that keep people alive. She says, almost as if reciting scripture that has been slightly battered by time, "My mother told me once, in a voice like dry smoke, never lower your head." Then she taps the post of her stall 3 times, and those who know what the taps mean nod. And the story makes its slight turn. But know, too, that some choices will cost others dearly. She then recites the refrain more quietly, not as accusation, but as memory. The mistress's cruelty turned against her own son. There is a final, unfashionable truth to such tales. They do not end with the swing of a pail. They fold into the ordinary years like a seam that both mends and marks. The people who survive by stitching what they can into a new life do so with the knowledge of what was paid. Benedita lived out her days near a low wall where Jasmine climbed and kept her head often bent not in submission, but in tending. When she passed through the seasons, Those who had known her carried a softened understanding. She had shaken the house's order. She had taken a burden onto herself and into the lives of others. The community kept her memory not as a triumphal banner, but as a complicated hymn. If legend has the power to teach, it teaches here that cruelty creates arcs of return that do not respect the neat divisions of justice. It also teaches that solidarity, quiet, patient, and prepared, can open seams in the most fortified places. Memory preserves both truths because memory is, by necessity, a repository for what cannot be unmade. People say the line still, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes as a reprimand to a child who is furnished with too much pride and too little humility. They say it to remember that power is not eternal, and that actions set in motion consequences that will find unexpected mouths. In the hush at the close of this tale, the refrain pulls itself together once more, not as a cry of vengeance, but as a cautionary bell. The mistress's cruelty turned against her own son. The words sit like a pebble one sets in the center of a dish. They throw ripples outward to those who hear them, and the ripples do the work of asking what it means to act with dignity in a world shaped by systems that do not measure the price of their violence. Thus the story rests, neither saintly nor damnatory, but as a thing that remembers and reminds. A woman kept her head for a reason her mother had taught, an act was done, lives were altered, and the memory of the night went on to live in songs, in warnings, in the small holding courts of human recollection. It is a tale of resistance lived in the marrow of days, and of consequences that circle back in ways both tender and terrible. The house continued to stand after a while, its columns still catching light. The sea still wore its indifferent face, and people, as they always do, went on deciding how to carry their heads and what debts they were willing to take upon themselves so that others might rise.